Hello, everyone. Um, it's easier to talk in front of 500 people than it is to talk after Lina does. It's, but I'll do my best. So, thank you, Lina. Okay, Lina just told you her story, a story about courage, about healing, about confronting the pain we carry within us. The thing is, we all have wounds to confront, and sometimes those wounds aren't just about what happened to us. They're about what we inherited, the people who shaped us, the ones who weren't there when we needed them. And today I want to share my story and how empathy became the only way I could make sense of the world. Interior night. A young boy lies in bed in a small post-industrial town in Eastern Europe. The kind of place where the air tastes like rust and the darkness smells like mold. It's midnight. His eyes are half closed, his hands clenched around the cheap Alcatel phone, listening to his mother's whispered voice. On the other end of the line, her voice is nothing more than a trembling breath. In the background, an Italian TV show plays on Rai Uno. She's not allowed to use the phone. Her employers made that clear. The boy can't make out her words, only the sadness in her voice, the exhaustion, because words are dangerous when you're an undocumented worker. That woman was my mother, and that 14-year-old boy was me. She was working in Italy so I could stay in school. And my father, absent, buried in books and programming, a man whose own father was never home. I grew up without male guidance, without a moral backbone. And so I found myself looking for mentorship in all the wrong places. The kids who spoke the language of power, the so-called tough ones, because that's what a lost kid thinks power looks like. But I always craved for something deeper, something real. Ever since I left home at 14, I felt emptiness. I felt an emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. I didn't have the words to describe it, and no one around me to help me make sense of it. And here's the thing, I wasn't alone. And even though this was more than 20 years ago, it's happening all around us today. Millions of boys are growing up with absent parents or absent fathers and parents so overwhelmed by life's struggles that they can't provide guidance for their children. And in this vacuum, boys are turning to the internet looking for role models. And they find them. Unfortunately, the loudest voices are often the most destructive. I see it everywhere. Boys idolizing influences, preaching power, dominance, and wealth at the expense of empathy, compassion, and humility. Because when you grow up feeling lost and rejected, anger is easier than love. And hatred, especially when wrapped in shiny packaging, is easier to cling to than hope. But I was lucky. I found something different, and it wasn't power, it was empathy. The kind that forces you to confront your own pain before you can even begin to understand someone else's. My journey into empathy started in the most unlikely of places, a semi-abandoned apartment on the top floor of a crumbling building in Bucharest. We called it Casa Jurnalistului, the house of the journalist. Some of you might know our troublemaking stuff back in the days. It wasn't a newsroom, it was a creative squat. Cigarette smoke, cheap coffee, arguments over storytelling ethics, bouncing off cracked walls. It was chaos, it was beautiful. We were a bunch of weird, lost kids, and we had no idea what we were doing. But when you don't know how to play by the rules, you make your own, and that's truly beautiful. And our rule was simple: tell the stories no one else would, about inequality, poverty, the people living on the margins of society. So all the fun stuff. I didn't start with empathy. I started with rage. Rage at the exploitation, rage at corruption, rage at a system that let kids like me grow up feeling completely abandoned. And we made noise with our stories. But despite all the attention, nothing really changed. It felt like shouting into a void. And that's when I realized something important. Rage alone wasn't enough. It wasn't changing anything. And I needed to dig deeper. So I took bigger risks. I went undercover, worked in factories and farms all over Europe with a hidden camera. I wanted to see for myself what people like my mother were going through when working abroad. So my first shift started at 3:30 a.m. in a UK meat packing factory. The air was cold and metallic, the machines were deafening, the managers always pushing us to work faster. It was grueling work, hours of slicing, packing, lifting, while your fingers go numb and your mind goes blank. But the worst part was seeing the faces of the people around me. They were the same people I saw in my childhood when they came for their summer holidays. Uncles, aunts, neighbors, family friends. People who had left everything behind to send money home, just like my mother. Their eyes were hollow. Their conversation no longer about how good life is in the West. It was mostly about homesickness, about waiting to return home. And for the first time, I truly understood the sacrifices our parents made. But even when investigations made an impact, when they were used by NGOs to advocate for workers' rights, or published by the international press, there was still something missing. I had become an effective investigator, but the urgency of the work had stripped away the humanity from the process. I was fighting for justice by exposing how laws and rules were being broken. But justice for me was also about creating understanding, about making people see the human beings behind the injustices. And that was something investigative reports and news pieces could never truly achieve. So I did what most people do when their work feels like it's swallowing them whole. I saved up some money and I bought a really cool cinema camera. And at first it was just a hobby. I played around during or between work trips. But 4 years later, that hobby became something bigger. It led me to a great film festival where my first film won a really amazing award. It was the story of a large family who had lived in the wilderness of Văcărești Delta, right here in Bucharest, for 20 years. And then the authority forced them to move, forced them to adapt to the life in the big city, to civilization, as the father of the family used to call it. Unlike the urgency and pressure of investigative journalism, film allowed me to slow down, to look deeper and to listen. Not just with my ears, but with everything I had. To capture something more than facts, to capture tiny pieces of human truth. But in the process of making this film, there was something that kept getting in my way. And that was the father of the family. And I couldn't understand him. I spent years of my life resenting my own father for being absent. So how could I accept a man who dragged his children into the wild, away from school, away from safety, just because he was terrified of the world? He was my antagonist. I demonized him during the writing and the editing, blaming him every time I saw his children suffer. But then something changed. I was about to become a father myself, and Lina and I were expecting our first child. And suddenly I realized something terrifying, that I would do anything to keep my child and my family safe. That's when I understood him, the father of this big family. I understood his desperation, his drive to protect his children from the very civilization he believed destroyed him. And that realization unlocked something inside me. It allowed me to see him not as a villain, but as a human being struggling to protect what he loved in his own twisted way. It allowed me to build a bridge to him, and that bridge was empathy. But that lesson was only the beginning. The real test came later when I had to confront my own biases and judgments about another father, Tata. And when Lina and I started working on Tata, I had to face this other world. Lina was both the screenwriter of our first film, and by then my life partner. Tata was her personal story, a story about domestic and labor abuse, about healing through love and reconciliation. But it was also a story about the father she had grown up fearing, a man who was violent to her more often than not. When Lina told me about her father for the first time, I didn't know what to think. I had seen men like him before. I had been raised to resent men like him. And the story I had built in my head was simple. He was a villain, the abusive, violent father. But Lina kept digging deeper. She wasn't willing to just present him as a monster. She wanted to understand him. And her courage to confront her own trauma, to dig into the darkest corners of her memory, was something I have never seen before. That's when I learned more about him, and he suddenly became this fascinating, conflicting character. Yes, he was a man who hurt his family, but he was also a man who stayed at a job where he was beaten and humiliated by his employer just to make sure his daughters could go to school, to give them a life better than his own. He did for Lina and her sisters what my father never did for us. He made sacrifices, even when he was broken, even when he had no tools or language to understand his own trauma. And then there was his hands, tough, scarred hands from years of labor. The kinds of hands I remembered from my own work undercover in those factories across Europe. The kind of hands that were shaped by poverty, by hope, by the desperation to give his children something better. The truth I had been avoiding was staring at me in the face, that he, like me, had grown up with a father who was never there, a man who had inherited his own darkness, and who was in his own messed up way trying to break the cycle. As painful as it is to admit, I could see a part of myself in him. That's what empathy does. It forces you to confront your own brokenness, to look at your own pain and see it reflected in others. And then somehow to find a way to forgive, to understand, and to listen. This realization was not just about Lina's father, it was about me, about my own father, about the rage I carried for years without even realizing how heavy it was. I realized that building a bridge to someone's humanity is the hardest kind of storytelling. It's not about shouting louder or exposing someone's flaws. It's about listening, even when your instincts tell you to yell. And so Lina and I built something together, a life, a family, and we promised ourselves that we would do things differently, just like every other couple, I guess. Because both of us come from broken homes. We are both children of absent fathers, but we are also children of resilience, of love, and of courage. And raising our own children, we have to confront those costs every single day, to listen to each other's pain, to understand our wounds, and to help each other heal. It's not easy, but it's ours. And the thing is, empathy is not just about telling someone else's story, it's about having the courage to look at your own and to make peace with it. We raise our children by constantly trying to listen, and that's really hard work. By constantly trying to understand each other, even when our fears clash, even when our wounds make us lash out, even when the world outside feels hostile and unforgiving. This is what storytelling has taught me. This is what Lena's story has taught me. And I hope somehow that it's what I can teach my children. Okay, now let's go back to the beginning. To that 14-year-old boy clutching to a phone in the darkness, trying to decode his mother's tears from thousands of kilometers away. A boy who grew up without a father figure. A boy who spent years trying to replace that absence with hollow ideas of power and masculinity. That boy is still out there, and he's not just me as a kid. He's millions of boys and young men growing up lost, angry, and desperate for something real. And the internet is flooded with voices ready to give them the answers. Loud voices, influences, preaching power, dominance, wealth. Voices that tell them anger is strength, that cruelty is confidence, that empathy is weakness. But empathy is not weakness. It's a weapon. A weapon that cuts through the noise, not by shouting louder, but by listening deeper. The personal is always political, and empathy is the bridge between the two. Empathy is what helped me understand that a man I had resented for so long, not just the father of the family in my first film, not just Lena's father, but my own father. And even more importantly, empathy is what allows me and reminds me day by day to be present for my children, to be real, to listen, and to break the cycle. Thank you guys so much.